In our last video, we ended with the fact that Tao Qian, he really emphasized the fact of going back home. Again, do understand that he is completely rejecting kind of the belief system of Confucianism, and he is more in support of a Taoist belief system, that idea of returning to nature, to oneness with it. Now, you're going to notice, though, that he does reject Buddhist tendencies here, because notice in that last stanza of the Return, he says, I have no desire for riches. So notice he doesn't want wealth. He says, and no expectation of heaven. Rather, on some fine morning to walk alone. Notice that idea of being a recluse. He says, now planting my staff to take up a hoe, to be a farmer. He says, or climbing the east hill and whistling long. Or composing verses beside the clear stream. Again, notice this idea of him being one with nature, enjoying himself in it. So I managed to accept my lot until the ultimate homecoming, rejoicing in heaven's command. So again, Tao Qian, he has human desire still. His desire is to find solace in his surroundings, in nature, in the small things in life. But he still, notice, has desire. He says, let us follow the inclinations of the heart. Now, that's like the heart's desire. That goes against the idea of dukkha in Buddhism. So understand that although Tao Qian does have some elements that are somewhat Buddhist, that becoming one with nature and also trying to get away from the busyness of a Confucianist lifestyle, he does veer more toward Taoism than he does Confucianism. Now, as far as Tao Qian, he was of the Qin dynasty, and this was a southern dynasty that was very prevalent during the time period of 365 to 492. Our next poet, though, we are going to be looking at Li Po. Now, Li Po, he is actually from the Tang dynasty, which is probably one of the most famous literary dynasties of the time period. Tang poetry, especially, is considered some of the most beautiful of Chinese literature and art, kind of the golden age of it. Now, as far as, Li Po, he's a little different than Tao Qian. Now, Li Po, he was actually, in many ways, someone who was a court poet. He did follow also Taoist imagery and belief systems in his poems. You're going to notice, especially within his second poem we're going to be looking at, he does talk about the enjoyment of wine, of alcohol. He does seem to navigate more toward a Buddhist belief system than Tao Qian did, but he did have an eccentric personality, but also a poetical talent. He was actually essentially gained entrance into Hanlin Academy, which was like essentially an academy of artists that was promoted by the emperor. And he was very close to the emperor at that time period until sadly he angered the emperor's, or one of the emperor's concubines. And when that happened, he was asked to leave. Now, as far as the mythology of his death, the mythology of Li Po's death is that he actually drowned while, attempting to gain the reflection of the moon in the water. But we don't know if that's really true. It's just kind of an interesting mythology in his life. Now, as far as Li Po, you're going to notice that he definitely has this oneness with the nature around him, which is Taoism. But he also does have some tendencies that are a little bit more, again, Buddhist in their belief system. But as far as Confucianism, Li Po did not work as a politician, but he did feel restricted in some ways within that court life that he was in when he worked essentially as a poet in Hanlin Academy. So let's look first at our poem Yearning. Now remember, Yearning is not in our textbook. You're going to need to go back to our website. Let me go to ours, and you're going to need to click on Yearning, which is B. When you click on that, this is our poem. Okay, now as far as yearning, okay, this very much so, okay, kind of exemplifies that idea of Buddhism, okay, that an individual who is in constant yearning for something that is unattainable, okay, that it is going to bring disappointment. And again, that's that concept of the dukkha, which we talked about, okay. Now you're going to notice we're not going to look at every line of this particular poem, but we have yearning. And again, this is yearning for the unattainable, but he uses this as a, kind of as a metaphor through the poet yearning for the moon, okay, which again, the moon as a tangible item is going to be unattainable to us. We can't just go up and grab it. But it's more as a metaphor for any of those things that are unattainable in our life. And again, if you keep yearning for that unattainable item or person, whatever it might be, that you're going to have constant disappointment. So notice he opens his poem, Endless Yearning, here in Changyong. Now, Changyong, this was actually a capital city, but it actually translated into perpetual peace, which you can notice our speaker does not have peace at this point because he's yearning. Again, he has dukkha, that disappointment. Now, you're going to notice, similar to our other poem, we do have some alliteration. We do have also some imagery with nature as well. Now, there's also that image of a lonely lantern, very reminiscent of, Tao Qian's lonely pine tree. But again, that loneliness, that reclusive nature of the Chinese poet is something to be admired. It's not something that's a sad kind of image that we have here. So you're going to notice we have this image of a night sky, okay? And we have this image of an autumn night. It describes the bed mat's color and it being cold, not very welcoming, and no light from the lonely lantern. The longing almost broken. Then roll up the curtain and gaze at the moon. Heave the sigh that does no good. So notice that image of the speaker waking up in the middle of the night, this cold mat, opening up, of course, this image of sort of the blinds, and he sees the moon in the sky. Notice that image of gazing at the moon, but heave the sigh that does no good, because again, he can't attain the moon. Even in its beauty and its glory, he can't have it. It's unattainable. Now, notice the personification that he uses. He uses the moon and compares it to a lady, okay, and an unattainable lady at that. He says, a lady lovely like the flowers, beyond the wall of clouds, and above the blue dark of heaven's high, and below the waves of pale waters, endless the sky, far the journey. The fleet soul suffers in flight. Notice that image of the soul suffering. As long as you attempt to yearn for those things that are unattainable, you are going to suffer. Again, that's the concept of dukkha, the Four Noble Truths of it that we discussed. So we end here, notice he says, and in its dreams can't touch its goal. He can never gain that goal of the moon or that unattainable goal, whatever it might be. He says, then endless yearning crushes a man's heart. So notice that image. If you have that constant yearning for the unattainable, there's going to be constant suffering. So notice Li Po here, he has more of a Buddhist poem. It does have Taoist elements because of the interaction with him and nature, especially, the crickets, the sound of crickets on that autumn night, the moon, his interaction with it. But also it's purely Buddhist in its kind of elements. Notice no Confucianism here, okay? It's completely against that belief system because it's more man's connection with nature. Notice there's no politics, there's no servitude to a political life in this poem. All right, well, we're going to move on to our next poem. Now, our next poem is also from Li Po, but this poem is Drinking Along with the Moon. Okay, now you're going to notice we continue kind of our themes of more of a Taoist and also Buddhist belief system in this particular poem. This poem is probably one of the most famous by Li Po because of course, the mythology of his death, him dying as he tried to attain the moon in the lake's reflection. And this kind of is reminiscent of that mythology of his death. But again, when you think of Li Po, as far as Tao Qian, he in many ways was sort of the reclusive poet. As far as Li Po, he's known more as the wandering poet. Supposedly after he left, the academy and left sort of this life of a court poem, he wandered along the river and just basically threw his wealth to anyone who needed it, and he spent his days essentially reciting poetry. Now, as far as this poem, this is very indicative of his writing, especially his appreciation of alcohol. If you read other Li Po poems, he does have a tendency to partake in alcohol, and he has no qualms about it. He's very proud about it, especially that feeling of connection that he receives with nature when he is a bit intoxicated. So let's look on page 1315 at Drinking Alone with the Moon. So notice we have sort of this image of sort of two sides of yourself. In this type of mythology, usually the moon is symbolic of unconscious thought versus the sun, which is more conscious thought processes. And we have sort of that image of two two selves, the yin and the yang almost in this Taoist elements. So let's look at the first line. A pot of wine among the flowers, of course, meaning a pot of wine that he's going to partake in a moment. I drink alone, no friend with me. He says, I raise my cup to invite the moon. He and my shadow and I make three. And notice that idea of the personification of the moon again, similar to our last poem, Yearning. But in this case, the moon is not female, likely more of an image of the male moon, a friend in a sense. And we have this image of he, his shadow, and the moon kind of coming together, okay, this union in nature of conscious, unconscious self and nature coming together to have this moment of solidarity. He says, the moon does not know how to drink. My shadow mimes my capering. He says, but I'll make merry with them both. Now, I know you're probably imagining someone drunk in the middle of the night, all, but to him, this is a very contented spiritual moment, this connection with nature and self. He says, and soon enough it will be spring. I sing. The moon moves to and fro. Notice that kind of interaction he with the moon. I dance. My shadow leaps and sways. Still sober. Notice alliteration in this poem as well. We exchange our joys. Drunk, and then we'll go our separate ways. Let's pledge beyond human ties to be friends and meet where the silver river ends. Now, at the heart of this poem is just that idea of connection of conscious self, unconscious self, and then nature becoming one, which is at the heart of Taoism. And also you're going to notice that this is very reminiscent of in Yearning, the connection to nature there, but in Yearning, there was more of that warning against having too much yearning for those desires. So again, hopefully you're going to find all of our Chinese poems that we've discussed from the middle period very beautiful in their appreciation of nature, but also how important it was to follow who you are. It's your essence, yourself. You know, for Tao Qian, he was not meant to be a politician, at least from his perspective. He was meant to be a very, rural farmer and enjoy that connection with nature. Li Po did not see himself restricted by court life from an emperor's, kind of rulings. He wanted to be free in nature to go wherever the whim took him, whether it was drinking at night with the moon or standing there gazing at the moon, whether he drowned himself in that feat or not. Hopefully you enjoyed these poems and they've proven as a distraction during this time. Thank you.